Julian Van Kester held the blackened canvas up to the gallery fluorescence, shook his head, and laughed. "This is the kind of naive counterfeit I see every week." Then he stepped into the alley, struck a match, and let the flames eat the painting while Delia Mee Sutton stood frozen on the sidewalk. It was only after the ashes cooled that his junior appraiser discovered it was a lost William Melton Halsey, conservatively valued at $1.2 million. And Julian's insurance covered nothing deliberate. Don't go anywhere. Drop your city and the time you're watching. I read every single one. And if you're new here, stay close. You'll want to see exactly how this ends. Delia Mee Sutton was a 67-year-old retired nurse from Charleston, South Carolina, who had been holding on to a single canvas for 40 years because an old woman whispered on her deathbed that it mattered. She didn't know the name William Melton Halsey. She just knew the tax lien was due, her granddaughter's tuition was overdue, and the only thing left to sell was wrapped in a bedsheet at the back of her closet. So she carried it 500 miles north to the Upper East Side of Manhattan, walked into one of the most prestigious galleries in the city, and asked a man in a $3,000 suit to tell her what it was worth. He burned it in the alley behind his building. And the full truth of what went into that flame is far stranger than anyone in that alley understood. To understand why a piece of American art history ended up in a trash fire behind a multi-million-dollar gallery, you have to go back to Charleston, South Carolina, in the summer of 1955. On the night of August 14th, a house on Rutledge Avenue caught fire. It was a modest wooden bungalow belonging to a 62-year-old social worker named Evelyn Price. By the time the trucks arrived, the roof had collapsed. The fire marshal listed the cause as faulty wiring and the contents as a total loss. Among the items officially declared destroyed was an oil painting by a local abstract expressionist named William Melton Halsey. The insurance ledger, filed weeks later, described it as an untitled canvas measuring 30 by 40 inches, valued at $800, and commissioned specifically for Miss Price in 1947. For more than 6 decades, that was where the story ended. But Evelyn Price did not die in that fire. She was pulled from the back bedroom by a neighbor who smelled the smoke. And when she broke free and ran back into the burning house before anyone could stop her, it was not for a photo album or a jewelry box. It was for that painting. She came out clutching the canvas, its edges singed and its surface blackened by soot, but still intact. She told the hospital nurse who stitched the burn on her forearm that the painting had been given to her by a man who saw something in her that no one else had, and she would never let it go. That nurse was a quiet 22-year-old nursing assistant named Delia Mee Sutton. For the next 3 decades, Delia and Evelyn stayed in each other's orbit. Delia brought groceries on Sundays, changed dressings, and eventually became the only person Evelyn trusted. In 1985, when Evelyn was 92 and fatting in a hospice bed, she took Delia's hand and told her to take the painting. She said it was worth holding onto. She said a great man made it for her and she had no provenance but her word. Delia took it home, wrapped it in a bedsheet and placed it at the back of her bedroom closet. It sat there for 40 years. Delia never hung it, never tried to sell it, never mentioned it to anyone outside her household. She was not running from the law or hiding a fraud. She was a retired nurse with a 7th-grade education and an accent that made people in offices speak to her slowly. She had raised a daughter alone, and that daughter had given her a granddaughter named Jasmine. By the spring of this year, Jasmine had been accepted to a nursing program with a tuition bill of $6,000 that Delia could not cover. A tax lien on the house was due in 60 days for just over $8,000. The refrigerator was 20 years old and made a noise at night like a man clearing his throat. So on a Tuesday morning in May, Delia pulled the canvas from the closet, wrapped it in brown paper from the Piggly Wiggly, and bought a Greyhound ticket to New York City. She had found the Van Kester Gallery online. The website was pristine white with gold lettering, promising free valuation appointments and private sales consultations. It said the gallery specialized in mid-century American abstraction. It did not say that Julian Van Kester, the 3rd-generation owner, had built a reputation on humiliating amateur collectors who brought in hopeful junk. It did not say that he called them attic warriors and held weekly mock sessions in the back office where his associates, a senior consultant named Paul Chesney and a junior appraiser named Ethan Webb, would compete to deliver the cruelest assessment. Ethan, 26 and still paying off a master's degree in art history from Columbia, hated those sessions. He had taken the job because Van Kester Sr. had been a legend. He was learning that the legend's son was something else entirely. When Delia walked in, the receptionist did not look up from her screen. The gallery smelled like fresh plaster and expensive leather. A Rothko hung in the vestibule, insured for more than Delia's entire neighborhood. She stood on the marble floor in her thrift store coat, holding a package wrapped in grocery store paper, and asked to see whoever was in charge. Julian Van Kester was in the back room examining a late Motherwell when Paul stuck his head in and said there was a walk-in. Julian sighed, set down his loupe, and said to bring her in. He would later tell the insurance investigators that he knew the painting was worthless the moment he saw the paper, but the truth was he did not look at the paper. He looked at Delia. The dark skin, the worn coat, the way her hands cradled the package like it contained something precious. He had decided before the tape was cut. He placed the canvas on a work table under a fluorescent lamp. The surface was so dark with age and smoke residue that the image beneath was barely readable, just a faint interplay of ochre and umber, the ghost of an angular form. There was no signature on the front, no stamp on the back, only a small notation in pencil so faint it required a magnifying glass to see. Julian straightened up and gave a short laugh. He said this was precisely the kind of student copy he saw every week. Paul Chesney leaned in and chuckled. He said it looked like someone tried to paint a Halsey with a dirty rag. Julian called the woman over and explained, in the patient tone a teacher uses with a slow child, that William Melton Halsey was a Southern abstractionist whose work hung in the Gibbs Museum, not in a broom closet wrapped in a sheet. He said the canvas lacked the immediacy of Halsey's mark-making, that the varnish was botched, that the composition had no kinetic pulse. Every word was correct and every word missed the point entirely. Then he smiled. He said the best way to learn was to watch. He asked Delia to follow him, and she did, a silent, dignified obedience born from a lifetime of being told where to stand. In the alley behind the gallery, the afternoon light was gray. A dumpster, a few milk crates, the smell of kitchen exhaust from the Italian restaurant next door. Julian held the canvas at arm's length. He pulled a matchbook from his pocket, the kind with the gallery's name embossed in silver. He struck one match. Paul recorded it on his phone. Ethan stood by the back door, frozen. Delia stood on the sidewalk a few feet away, her hands at her sides. The flame caught the old varnish instantly. Black smoke curled upward and the canvas began to peel in sheets of ash. Julian dropped the remains into the dumpster and wiped his hands. He said something about a 60-second masterclass, and then he and Paul walked back inside. Delia did not move. She watched the smoke thin and the ashes settle. Then she turned and began the long walk back to Port Authority, with nothing in her hands and 40 years of a dead woman's word drifting into the Manhattan sky. Ethan Webb did not sleep that night. He lay in his apartment in Queens and stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment. Not the fire. The moment before. He had taken a photo of the canvas under the UV light for the gallery's internal records, a standard procedure he had done 100 times. But something about the notation on the back kept surfacing in his mind. At 2 in the morning, he got out of bed and opened his laptop. He pulled up the photo and zoomed into the lower corner where the pencil mark was. It was not a smudge. It was a number that matched the format of a vintage insurance catalog he had been digitizing for a separate estate just the day before. His hand was shaking when he cross-referenced the entry. The screen returned a single result. Untitled Ash Wednesday, oil on canvas, 30 by 40 inches. Commissioned 1947 by William Melton Halsey for Evelyn Price. Status: lost, presumed destroyed in residential fire, August 14, 1955. Ethan Webb sat very still in the dark of his studio apartment, the cursor blinking next to the number that matched the faint pencil mark on the back of Delia's canvas. The painting Julian Van Kester had just torched in a dumpster was not a student copy. It was a lost masterwork, and Ethan had stood frozen in the doorway while it burned. He did not sleep. At 4 in the morning, he cross-referenced the catalog number against the Gibbs Museum's digital archive and found a preliminary sketch from 1946 labeled in Halsey's own handwriting, "Gift for Evelyn." The composition matched the ghost of the image he had seen under the gallery fluorescents, the same angular forms, the same interplay of ochre and earth. There was no ambiguity. A piece of American art history had been reduced to ash in 90 seconds, and Julian had laughed while the smoke rose. Ethan arrived at the gallery before anyone else, his hands cold. He pulled up the photo he had taken, zoomed in on the notation, and placed it side by side with the insurance ledger entry. Then he waited. Julian walked in at 9 with an espresso and a smirk, already composing an anecdote for his next dinner party. Ethan closed the office door. He laid his phone on the desk and said the words aloud. The painting was real. The valuation is preliminary, but conservative estimates put it north of 1.2 million. Julian's smirk held for a full second before it became something else. Not guilt. Rage. He told Ethan to delete the photo immediately. He said if this ever left the room, he would personally see Ethan blacklisted from every auction house and museum on the eastern seaboard. His voice was low and flat and entirely serious. Then Paul Chesney knocked and walked in, and Julian's face rearranged itself into the easy confidence of a man who had just solved a problem. By noon, Paul's private group chat received the alley video. By 1, someone had forwarded it to an art writer at the New York Times. By 2, the headline was live. Manhattan gallerist burns $1.2 million Halsey, calls it a lesson. The video showed the entire sequence: the lit match, the casual toss, the canvas peeling in sheets of black smoke, Julian dusting his hands, and behind him the frozen silhouette of an old woman who did not scream or curse or move. The clip accumulated 1 million views in an hour, then 5, then 20. The comments were merciless, but the loudest voices were the ones asking the same question over and over. Who was the woman? Delia Mee Sutton was sitting on a bench in Port Authority when a stranger showed her the video. She watched Julian's match flare on the tiny screen, watched the flames consume 40 years of Evelyn Price's last whispered request, and then she lowered the phone and did not speak for a long time. Later she would say she thought about her granddaughter's tuition, about the tax lien, about the refrigerator that made that noise at night. She thought about walking back into that gallery and demanding something, though she was not sure what. But mostly she thought about Evelyn's hand on hers in that hospice room, the skin thin as tissue paper, the words worth holding onto. Delia had held on, and now there was nothing left to hold. The insurance investigator arrived at Van Kester Gallery the following morning. Julian had already filed a claim describing the incident as an accidental fire during an informal evaluation. The investigator, a woman named Catherine Okonkwo, had seen the video. She asked Julian to clarify how a deliberate, self-congratulatory burning with a matchbook embossed in the gallery's own branding qualified as accidental. Julian's attorney spoke over him. Catherine closed her notebook and said the recommendation would be denial of coverage on grounds of willful destruction. Julian Van Kester was now personally liable for every cent, but the financial ruin was only half the story. The art historian who entered the picture next was a woman named Dr. Margaret Halsey Crane, the painter's granddaughter, who had spent 20 years cataloging his work. She released a statement from her office at the Gibbs Museum that reframed the entire event. She explained that William Melton Halsey painted Untitled, Ash Wednesday in 1947 as a gift to Evelyn Price after Price saved his 11-year-old son Peter from drowning at Folly Beach the summer before. Halsey, a white man from an old Charleston family, and Price, a black social worker who ran a small community outreach out of her home, maintained a quiet, entire friendship for nearly a decade, exchanging letters and small artworks. Ash Wednesday was the only major canvas Halsey ever gave her, completed on Ash Wednesday itself, and deliberately titled to mark sacrifice and renewal. Its destruction did not just vaporize $1 million. It erased a monument to an interracial bond that had survived Jim Crow. Dr. Halsey Crane ended her statement with a sentence the press quoted everywhere. "My grandfather painted a bridge when bridges were illegal." Julian Van Kester lit the match. Delia read those words on a borrowed phone in her daughter's kitchen back in Charleston, the bus ride home a blur, the brown paper still folded in her coat pocket. She wept for the first time since the fire, not for the money but for Evelyn's voice, now doubly lost. Reporters were on her lawn by the next morning. The story had become a national referendum on the art world's contempt for ordinary people, on the casual violence of institutional arrogance, on a white man in a suit who looked at a black woman's inheritance and saw garbage. The New York State Attorney General's office opened a preliminary inquiry into potential criminal mischief charges. The gallery's board suspended Julian pending internal review. Paul Chesney gave an interview blaming the incident entirely on Julian's abusive culture. The dumpster behind the gallery became a pilgrimage site, but the detail that cracked everything wide open came 3 days later from a forensics lab in Brooklyn. Catherine Okonkwo, the insurance investigator, had collected a sealed evidence bag of residual ash from the dumpster before the sanitation truck arrived, a standard procedure in high-value claims. She sent it to the lab with no particular expectation. The analysts sifted through the carbonized debris and found something that made the lead technician call Catherine at home after hours. Embedded deep within the layers of burned canvas, still legible under infrared light, was a single, unburned fragment no larger than a postage stamp. And on that fragment, in a shade of gold paint that had been protected by a layer of varnish, were 3 letters, the artist's signature. The 3 letters were identical to the signature on every authenticated Halsey in the Gibbs collection. The looping capital W, the sharp M, the H that tilted slightly left, a habit the painter had never corrected. The Brooklyn lab ran the gold pigment through mass spectrometry. It matched the exact chemical composition of a batch Halsey purchased from a Parisian supplier in 1946. The canvas fibers dated to 1947. The varnish contained traces of Charleston pine soot, consistent with a household fire. This was not merely a lost masterpiece. It was a fingerprint, an artist's deliberate hidden mark left in the corner of his most personal work, exactly where Ethan Webb's photograph had captured the faint pencil notation that started it all. And it had been sitting in a dumpster while Julian Van Kester wiped his hands. Catherine Okonkwo's final report landed on the insurance directory's desk with a one-word recommendation: deny. Willful destruction by the policyholder rendered every clause void. Julian Van Kester was now on the hook for the full $1.2 million, and that figure was only the beginning. The Halsey Crane estate filed a separate claim for cultural loss. Delia Me Sutton, represented by a pro bono civil rights attorney from Charleston, filed a third suit for conversion, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and reckless destruction of property. The New York Attorney General added a criminal charge of second-degree criminal mischief, a felony carrying up to 7 years. And then the internet detectives did what they always do. They found the receipts. A former Van Kester gallery intern, now a curator in Los Angeles, posted a series of internal emails from 2018. In one chain, Julian referred to walk-in consignments from black families as welfare portfolios. In another, he bragged about a wastebasket appraisal he'd given an elderly Haitian woman who brought in a piece later authenticated by Sotheby. He wrote, "She'll never know. That's the art." The emails spread under the hashtag Van Kester Tapes, and by the end of the week, 3 more families came forward with stories of being dismissed, mocked, or pressured into selling undervalued pieces. One of them, a retired postal worker from Newark, had brought in a signed Romer Bearden collage and was told it was a print worth $40. Julian bought it for $60. It sold privately 6 months later for $320,000. The pattern was not negligence. It was predation. The revelation that broke the gallery's remaining credibility, however, came from Ethan Webb. Julian's attorneys had drafted a statement for him to sign, swearing that Julian had acted in good faith, that the painting appeared to be a crude imitation, and that the alley fire was a spontaneous educational demonstration. Ethan refused. He handed the unsigned statement to the Attorney General's office instead, along with his own sworn affidavit describing the internal mock sessions, the scorekeeping of cruelty, and the direct order to delete evidence. He told investigators he had a student loan balance of $47,000 and that he expected his career to end the moment he walked into that building. He did it anyway. His affidavit was leaked that same afternoon. The art world split into two camps, those who hailed him as a whistleblower and those who said he had merely flipped to save himself. Ethan did not give interviews. He posted a single line on an account with 12 followers. "I should have spoken in the alley," but it was the letter that changed everything. Dr. Margaret Halsey Crane held a press conference at the Gibbs Museum on the morning the lab report was made public. She stood at a lectern in front of a projected image of the recovered gold fragment and read aloud from a yellowed sheet of paper her grandmother had preserved in a cedar chest for 76 years. It was dated February 19, 1947, in William Halsey's tight script. "Dearest Evelyn, enclosed is Ash Wednesday, which I have named for the day I began it. You will see nothing on the canvas but color and memory, for that is how I see you. I have hidden my name in gold in the lower left, not as a signature for galleries, but as a private covenant between us. This painting belongs to you in a way that no auction house can ever touch. If you ever sell it to someone who understands that art is a debt, not an asset. Yours, William." Dr. Halsey Crane paused. She said the gold signature had been a secret between two friends in a city where their friendship could have destroyed them both, and that Julian Van Kester had burned that covenant in 90 seconds, but the fire had not been able to erase the gold. She then introduced Delia Mee Sutton, who stood at the side of the room in a navy dress borrowed from her daughter, her hands folded in front of her, exactly as she had stood in the alley. Delia did not read a prepared statement. She said quietly that she had promised a dying woman to take care of something precious, and she had failed. She said she was not a rich woman, and $1 million sounded like fairy tale money to her, but she did not want the check that Julian Van Kester's lawyers had offered through a mediator the night before. She wanted him to say Evelyn Price's name. She wanted him to say it out loud in a room full of his peers and explain why he lit the match. Then she sat down, and the museum hall, packed with reporters and historians and Charleston residents who remembered Evelyn Price's house calls during polio season, was silent for 4 full seconds before the applause began. Julian Van Kester's attorneys issued a statement that evening calling Delia's account inconsistent and the online mob a threat to due process. They announced a countersuit for defamation. But the criminal charges were already filed, and the trial date was set for March of the following year. The question hanging over the entire proceeding was not whether Julian had burned the painting. The video proved that. It was whether a jury would see the destruction of art as a property crime or as something far weightier, the deliberate annihilation of a black woman's inheritance, a lost friendship, and a shared piece of American memory. And that question was about to be answered by a single witness nobody expected to testify. The witness was a 19-year-old nursing student named Jasmine Sutton. Delia's granddaughter had been sitting in the gallery of the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse for 3 days, watching Julian Van Kester's defense team paint her grandmother as a confused opportunist who had brought in a worthless canvas and then manufactured a provenance after the fire. On the 4th morning, the prosecution called Jasmine to the stand. She produced a phone she had purchased from a prepaid kiosk 2 days before the burning. On it was a recording of a call Julian's attorney had made to Delia the night after the video went viral, offering $40,000 in exchange for a signed release of all claims and a public statement that Delia had misunderstood the nature of the appraisal. Delia, on the recording, asked if she could have time to pray about it. The attorney laughed. Jasmine played the full audio in open court. The jury heard the laugh. Then they heard Julian's own voice in the background, unmuted on speakerphone, saying 4 words that changed everything. Just get her signature. This goes away and I go back to work. The defense objected. The judge overruled. Julian Van Kester had just testified against himself. The trial lasted 11 days. Ethan Webb walked the jury through the mock cruelty sessions in the back office. Paul Chesney, under subpoena, admitted to filming the alley fire on Julian's instruction and forwarding it to the group chat. Catherine Okonkwo presented the lab report on the gold fragment with the patience of a woman who had watched every possible objection collapse before it reached her lips. Dr. Margaret Halsey Crane read her grandfather's letter aloud again, and when she finished, the foreperson in the third row was wiping her eyes with her sleeve. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Julian Van Kester was convicted of second-degree criminal mischief, a felony, and sentenced to 22 months in state prison. The civil judgment followed 3 months later. Delia Mee Sutton was awarded $1.2 million, plus $300,000 in punitive damages. The insurance carrier denied coverage in full. The Van Kester Gallery filed for bankruptcy within the quarter. The building on East 71st Street was sold at auction and became a nonprofit community art space 12 months later, its board composed entirely of artists of color. But the story did not end in a courtroom. The gold fragment, the one that had survived the flame, was mounted in a small glass case and donated to the Gibbs Museum. It sits now in the permanent collection, not as a painting, but as a relic. Beside it is a digital reconstruction of Ash Wednesday, assembled by graduate students from the original Halsey sketch, Ethan Webb's photograph, and Dr. Halsey Crane's archival records. The reconstruction is imperfect, but it is whole. Evelyn Price's name appears on the wall text in letters the same size as William Halsey. The covenant is finally public. Delia used a portion of the settlement to pay her granddaughter's tuition in full. Jasmine Sutton graduated with honors and took a job at a community clinic in North Charleston, the same neighborhood where Evelyn Price once made house calls during polio season. The tax lien was lifted. The refrigerator was replaced. And on a Sunday morning in June, Delia walked into the small Baptist church where she had worshiped for 40 years and placed a check for $100,000 in the offering plate. The pastor stopped the service. Delia did not speak from the lectern. She simply said, "Evelyn kept her promise, I kept mine. Let the church keep the rest." There is one final detail that the news never reported. In the weeks after the verdict, a package arrived at Delia's house with no return address. Inside was a small, fireproof safe. It contained a stack of letters between William Halsey and Evelyn Price, written between 1945 and 1955, the year of the fire. The letters had been held for decades by a lawyer in Columbia who died without instructions, and his daughter found them while settling the estate. They detailed a friendship of quiet radicalism, of shared books and arguments about art and faith, of a white man who painted and a black woman who organized, both of them knowing that their correspondence was illegal in parts of their own state. In the final letter, Halsey wrote that he had hidden a second signature on the canvas, a private mark invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it. It was not in gold, he wrote, but in charcoal. A cross, drawn directly into the wet paint on Ash Wednesday morning, the same day the church begins its season of repentance. It had been there the whole time, hidden beneath the varnish and the soot. It had been there when Delia carried the canvas up the Greyhound steps. It had been there when Julian Van Kester struck the match. And it had been there when the smoke rose into the gray Manhattan sky, a silent record of something that fire, for all its hunger, could not touch. Julian Van Kester lit a match because he believed the value of something was determined entirely by the person holding the match. He looked at an old woman in a thrift store coat and saw no provenance, no pedigree, no art. He saw a lesson he could teach. But the lesson was always his, waiting to be learned. And the painting burned in his hands while the thing he could not see remained exactly where it had been for 76 years. Hidden beneath the smoke and the soot and the ashes, invisible to anyone who only looked at the surface, was a cross drawn in charcoal on Ash Wednesday by a man who understood that some things are not meant to be proven. They are meant to be kept. Every family has something wrapped in a bedsheet at the back of a closet. A story, a secret, a promise made to someone who is no longer here to enforce it. Delia Mee Sutton carried hers for 40 years, and when the world finally saw what she had been holding, it was already gone. But the truth of it did not disappear. It surfaced in a lab in Brooklyn, in a letter in a cedar chest, in the voice of a granddaughter who pressed record when it mattered most. The fire did not win. The arrogance did not win. The woman who refused to let go of a friend's last whispered word won, and she won quietly, the way Evelyn Price would have wanted. Here is the question this story leaves behind. What have you been told is worthless because the person who told you so could not see its worth? And who gets to decide what is precious and what is garbage? That question is older than any painting, and it waits for an answer in alleys and galleries and courtrooms and kitchens, everywhere that power mistakes its own limitations for the final word. Drop that in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved something in you, send it to one person who needs to hear it. Because somewhere right now, there is someone holding on to a promise that the world has already dismissed, and they just need to know that holding on was never a mistake. If you are not subscribed yet, stay close. There is another story coming next week that I honestly cannot wait to tell you. Until then, may the things worth keeping always find the hands that will not let them go.